Family Search again. So last week we went over the basic functions of Family Search, particularly the tree views and the profile navigation. And we also went over some things about merging duplicates. We went over indexing, and we also went over some of the temple functions on Family Search. But today we're going to talk more about research tools and some of the hidden gems on Family Search that will help you find some more information about people in your tree and learn more about how to make your research more complete. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we're going to go to Family Search. Now, if you can't see this, send a chat, or if you need me to slow down, you can send a chat, or you can raise your hand or flag anything. Just let me know. But like I said, today we're going to be going over the hidden gems of researching on Family Search and the basic information that each person in your tree needs to have for the research to be quote unquote complete. Before we begin on Family Search research, though, I'm going to show you how to create all of your affiliate accounts. And I'm not sure how many of you have already have access to these, but it's a really amazing thing. The church has made deals with each of the databases so that we could have access to them for free if you are a member of the church. So if you have a Family Search account with your membership ID attached to it, you should be able to get these all for free. And if you are unsure, if you know, if you're unsure about whether or not you have a Family Search account attached to your membership number, you do if you can see the temple information. If you can reserve things, if you can see what temple things have been done, then you have access to these databases. So to get to those affiliates, you're going to go to familysearch.org/partner access. Now, the church has made deals with each of these databases, and the total cost of these, if you were to just pay for them yourself, would be about $921 a year. So each member has access to these really amazing databases for free just because you have a Family Search account. And you have access to Ancestry.com, which is super useful, Find My Past, My Heritage, American Ancestors, and JanaeaNet. Ancestry.com is the most useful for American, Canadian, Mexican, and British ancestors, mostly your North American research. And it also has a really good tree function if you don't want anybody else to touch your family tree. So that's one thing about Family Search, is anybody can work on your tree and change the information. And sometimes that's a really good thing, and sometimes it can be a really frustrating thing when somebody goes in and changes all the hard work that you did with no explanation. It can be really frustrating. So Ancestry is a good place to keep a backup tree that nobody else touches but you. And you can import your tree from Family Search to Ancestry. So it's not even that hard to do. It also has a better search function for things like censuses and birth and marriage and death records, because the people who index for Ancestry are paid to be indexers. So they have a little bit of a higher performance on average than the teenage volunteers that tend to do indexing for the church. Not that it's a bad thing, but the Ancestry has a really good index for most of their records. And you can also suggest edits if something is indexed incorrectly, which Family Search is just barely starting to do. Find My Past is primarily for British and Irish. You're not going to have a whole lot there if you're working on your your American ancestors, but it's also a very good resource, especially for things like the 1939 little census they did over there before World War II, some British military things. That's a great place. Excuse me. MyHeritage is based in, it's a company based in Israel, and they have DNA testing as well as Ancestry, and they have a good selection of newspapers and Canadian records, and they have a really good comprehensive search of family trees on FamilySearch, as well as MyHeritage. American Ancestors is exactly what the title suggests. It's for your American ancestors, primarily in New England, and for colonial ancestors. So if you have ancestors that came over on the Mayflower, American Ancestors is a great resource for you. Genealogy is a French website, but it's in English if you're in the United States and when you sign up for it, so you don't have to know French to use it. But it primarily has European resources, and it's basically just a giant genealogical library. The ones that I use the most are definitely Ancestry.com, and then occasionally Find My Past and MyHeritage. But they're all really useful, and it's a really great resource that you have access to for free if you are connected to your membership ID on FamilySearch. And I really encourage you to sign up for all of your affiliate databases so you can really maximize the amount of records that you're able to find, and it'll just make researching a lot easier. Okay, so now let's go into researching for and searching for records. So we went over last time some of the tree views that are really useful. And if you remember, there are a few easy ways to see what records are being suggested to you. And that's a really great way to start. It's the easiest way to search for historical records, to see what FamilySearch has already suggested to you. And the one place to look for that is just on the FamilySearch homepage. If you look here on the right-hand side, it'll say recommended tasks, and you can sort by records, and it will bring up all the records that they think that your ancestor is in. So they only bring up 5 at a time, but you can always show more. And it's not necessarily the most organized. So if you just want to attach records without necessarily focusing on one ancestor, this is a great place to go. If you are interested on focusing on one particular ancestor, my favorite places to go is to the tree. And if you remember last time we talked about the fam chart view, and the fan chart view has several different ways to view it, and one of the ways you can do it is for research helps. And research helps, all these blue items right here are helps that say record hints. So these are great places to start on bolstering your family tree and getting more evidence about each ancestor, to find more names and to really bolster that family tree. And some of the other research suggestions are also helpful, but today we're just going to focus on these blue ones. So you can look at these record hints also on the profile or the person view. So we're going to go to this ancestor right here of mine that is closest to me. That's also a good rule of thumb. When you start closer to yourself, you're going to have more success on your way back. It's easy to get excited and want to fill in the gaps in your family tree, but the best way to fill in those gaps is to fill in what you already know first. Start closest to you and then work your way out. And a lot of the questions that you run into for your ancestors that are farther back will be answered before you even get there, because you've already done the research on the people closer to you. So let's go to this ancestor right here, my great-grandfather. Let's look at what records FamilySearch thinks that my great-grandfather is in. And the place to see that is right here on this right-hand side under Research Helps. And it says there's 2 records that they think my ancestor is in. Now, these look like they're the same record, but they may or may not be. But let's just look at it and see what they have to say. So we have James Claridge Ellsworth, and that matches the name. It's a birth certificate. It says he was born on April 8th, which matches what I have right here in Thatcher, Arizona, which is also what I have right there. And he was born to James Clarence and Julia Claridge. Now, if I look down at his parents right there, that's a perfect match. So I don't have to explain why I attached this record because all the information matches perfectly. And so I'm going to go ahead and show you how to review and attach. So we're going to just click the review and attach, and what it's going to do is bring up the record, and it's going to tell all the information that they have indexed for your record. And it's going to let you choose what information you want to attach and what information you don't, and if you think that it's really a match. So we look at my ancestor, it says, this is what the record says over here. James Claridge, male, born April 8th, 1908 in Thatcher, Arizona. So it looks like a perfect match. I don't have to type a reason because it's such a perfect match, but if I did have a question, if I wasn't sure, it's always a good idea to explain why you think the record is a match. So I'm going to attach it. And you can always detach it if you make a mistake or if it's attached to the wrong person. You can also attach it to his parents if you'd like. I'm not going to take the time to do that now. But it's always a good idea to attach the record to anybody who is in the record. Something that a lot of people don't do is look at the record in more detail. So if we go to the record, you see that there is an image here, and they've already got an index, and a lot of people will just attach it looking at the index, say it's good information, great, and move on. But it is very important to always look at the image if you have one available. There's usually a lot more information included in a record than is indexed. And it can be really useful to solving those brick walls or questions, or even finding more people to add to your family tree and do temple work for. So if we look at this image, this is the image that I just attached to my ancestor. And it has all this great information that wasn't even indexed. The fact that he was full term, he wasn't premature, not super important genealogically, but it's still a good story. He was legitimate. That means that his parents were married before he was born, which means I can look for a marriage record before 1908. It has the name of his father and where he's currently living, Kansas City, Missouri. Now, I probably wouldn't have looked for a census record in Kansas City, Missouri, because this is an Arizona birth record. But that's a good clue to look for where the family maybe went to afterwards. It said that he was 46 years old when his son was born, that he was born in Luna Valley, New Mexico, that he's a business manager for a wholesale cosmetics company. It has information about my ancestor's mother, that she was 45 at the last birthday. So this is probably a delayed birth certificate, because most people aren't 46 and 45 when they're having children, but it's possible. That's something I need to pay attention to. It says she was born in Thatcher, Arizona, which is the same place that my ancestor was born. It says that he was born alive at 1:15 a.m. and this is his doctor. And so there's all of this great information that wasn't indexed because it's not necessary to do the temple work for, but this gives me great clues. Like this is a good source for my great-grandfather's father and where he was born and his mother and where they're living and things like that. So it's always important to look at the actual image and don't just trust the index, because sometimes it's incorrect or sometimes there's just missing information. So it's always a good idea to look at that image. Oops. Okay. So another thing to pay attention to is on these research helps right here. The algorithm will take all this information that's right here in the vitals, and it will search for the records for you, and it will give you these suggested records, but that doesn't mean that the algorithm is perfect. You need to pay special attention to your ancestors that have common names. For example, I have an ancestor whose name is James Smith, and he lived in London. He was married to a woman named Jane Johnson. So if you can imagine, in London, England, there's probably several hundred, if not thousands, of James Smiths, and there's probably hundreds of Jane Johnsons, and not every record that was recorded with that name is going to be your ancestor. So it's important to pay attention to relationships and dates and places, and be careful, especially if your ancestor has one of those common names, so you can be accurate about which records are for which person. And for example, this ancestor whose name was James Smith, I had to clean up his FamilySearch sources because one well-meaning researcher attached all the sources from the suggestions without actually checking. And this ancestor of mine had censuses in England and Wales and the United States, all for the same year, where it said he was living in all these different places in 1870. And now it's not totally impossible that James Smith jumped the pond and back to Wales and into England and had 3 different families. And it's very unlikely though, and that was very difficult and expensive to do back then. So in most cases, people were pretty stagnant. They didn't move too much, too far, and they definitely didn't move in the same year from England to America to Wales, all within the same month. That was just impossible. So pay attention to those things and don't just blindly, don't just blindly attach sources. Let's see. Sorry, 1 second. I'm trying to, okay. So when you're also looking for these records and looking at these research helps, it's also important to remember that they miss a lot of records as well. Just because it's not suggested doesn't mean that the record doesn't exist. So be sure to check the other databases as well, because some of these databases have different record sets than FamilySearch. And if you remember from last time, we talked about the profile view and how if you click on this right side under search records, it'll take all this information and it will search these databases for you with that information, so you don't have to type it in. So this is a great place to go to if you want to get a little bit in depth. Let's say you've attached all the sources that are suggested and you want to see if there are any more. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. If you click on the FamilySearch, that's what we're going to focus on today. It'll take all that information and it'll remind you up here which ancestor is being searched for. So it tells me I'm searching for James right now, and it will put in all that information for you so you don't have to type it. And it will say, these are all of the records that we think he might be in. And there's 1,705 results. Now, not all of these are going to be your ancestor, but it's a lot more than just the 2 suggested. You can look on here and see what has already been attached. This little tree, family tree symbol means that it's attached to somebody. Sometimes that's your ancestor and sometimes it's not. So don't just assume. But most of the time, if you have if you don't have any duplicates, then it's going to show up. And then this one is not attached, so that's one that I do have to attach. This symbol right here is just, you can see the record details. And this one shows that you can see the image here, or that the image is on a different site. So for example, when I click on this record, you can see all of this information that's been indexed. And it says, here's some similar historical records that we think your ancestor was in, and if they've been attached. It has a citation if you want to put it in a book or a report. This is mostly used for professional genealogists, but it's always a good idea to cite your sources if you're writing a report for your family, so they can go and look at that source themselves. Now, at first glance, it looks like there is no image, but if you read it, it says these images are available at findagrave.com. And like I said earlier, it's important to check and make sure that you look at the image, because you're going to get more information. So you can see the actual headstone, which is great. You can see other pictures you might not have known were attached to your ancestor. You can see other little information. And a lot of times I'll find obituaries or biographies that people have written that aren't necessarily indexed. So don't be afraid to look at these affiliate sites and look at these indexes, or look at the images. Okay. So now let's talk about which records are most important, because can people hear me still? Yeah, okay. So let's talk about the records that are most important, because you're not going to want to sift through all 1,700 records of these and make sure that it's your ancestor. But there are a few different record types that are really important to learning the most you can about your ancestors. And when you find these records and attach them, you increase your likelihood of finding new names and filling in your family tree. The most important records to find for each and every person in your tree are the vital records, and depending on where your ancestor lived, census records. Vital records are the records that record the most vital events in somebody's life. So you think about the most important things that happened in your life, that would be your birth, your marriage, and your death. And depending on the time and place, your ancestor may not have all of these records. Especially in the United States, it really varies by state when these records were government mandated. So that does not mean that you don't need those sources, though, to support these events. For example, the state of Utah did not require birth certificates until 1898. And we know that lots and lots of people were born between 1847, when the pioneers arrived, and 1898 in Utah, but we are not going to find a government issued birth certificate saying that these people were born. So it's important to find alternate sources that can corroborate that information. For example, for many foreign countries, church records were just as good as government records, because countries had state religions. So like for England or Mexico, where the state religion is the Church of England and Catholic Church, those church records can serve as birth, marriage, and death records in many cases. Christenings and baptisms almost always list the date of birth. Marriage is self-explanatory, and burial records for churches almost always include a date of death. So if you're looking in foreign countries, that's a great place to start, in those church records. Other sources you can use to prove birth would be, for example, death certificates. obituaries, gravestones, family records, like family Bibles, and even census records will give you a clue as to when that ancestor was born, even if they don't have a birth certificate. Genealogists like to refer to this as direct and indirect evidence. Direct evidence directly answers the research question. Indirect evidence requires multiple pieces of evidence together to prove an answer to your question. So the more sources that you have for a piece of information, the stronger the information is. So before Arizona released these birth certificates, I had to rely on multiple sources to prove that my ancestor was born in 1908. Now you can look at these sources right next to the information under vitals on the profile view. And you can just click on the sources and it'll tell you every source they have is attached to prove this ancestor's name. And here's every source that's attached to prove his birth. There's 11 sources. I'm not sure what this christening is. I don't know who attached that. Let me see. Okay. But that's good information. And it has all the sources attached to that information. So the more you have, the better your evidence. And it's important to also remember that sources and records aren't perfect. Names can be misspelled, dates can be estimated. Just use your best judgment and be sure to record why you think a record matches your ancestor if you have to make assumptions. I can't tell you how many times I've helped somebody and they have ignored a record because the record said Jimmy Ellsworth instead of James Ellsworth. And they're like, well, my ancestor's name was James. Why would they record it as Jimmy? Be flexible with what the records are telling you. If the information is good and everything looks good except for some discrepancy and maybe the census is a year off, maybe it's even 10 years off, but all the other information seems to match, use your best judgment. Let it be detective work. Let the sources work together to create a good source. Sometimes a record does not have, like I said earlier, it's always important to look at record images, and sometimes those images don't show up, but that doesn't mean that those images don't exist. So that's usually due to privacy laws and agreements, but that doesn't mean you can't see the image, and that's especially important when you think about your family history centers. That's what they're there for mostly. That's so you can see some of these images that you otherwise can't see at home. And I'm sure most of you have heard of microfilm, and that is what indexing is pulled from, but not every image is indexed either. So let's go over how to see some of those images. If you go to search records, I'm just going to type somebody in, and we're going to find one that doesn't have an image but does have an index, and I'm going to show you how you can find that image. Oops. Sorry. So let's just go Jane Smith, and let's say she was born in Scotland. And let's see. So here's a record. Now, if you look at it, there's no image, but what you do see is all this document information. Now, it might be minimized. So when you maximize it, it has all this information that looks like total gibberish. But what it is actually is the microfilm number for the image that they index this from. Now, FamilySearch has been starting to look for those images and say, hey, it might have come from this. You need to look through the images and make sure that it is. This symbol usually means that you need to be in a family history center to view it. But let's just go ahead and copy this. If you copy that microfilm number, I'll show you where you can find the information about that microfilm. So if you go to catalog right here, you can also find it under the search menu bar. The catalog is probably the most unknown but useful source that FamilySearch has considering records. You can search the catalog by place. Say you want to see all the records that are for a certain town or a certain county. You can do by surname or author. Or you can search by microfilm number. So instead of call number, you're going to go film number. And then if you paste that and press search, it'll bring up the record that they found for you. You can click on it. And it's going to take a long time to load, but you can click on it and it will show you all the information, all this long information. That's really long, and it's usually not that long. But it'll tell you that this record came from Scotland and it's in English. There's 4,000 microfilm reels, and you don't want to search through all of those. So once all of this loads, it will bring up, wow, I think I found the longest description in the notes ever before. So sorry about that loading wait. Better. It's gonna load forever. Okay. So if we go back to search results. Sorry, my internet. So let's say I want to find a record in Jalisco, Mexico. Let's say my ancestors from there. When you go to the catalog and you click on a certain record, let's say I found an index and I found the microfilm number and it's 639960. Let's say that that was the microfilm number. So now I know that it's in this particular book of baptisms, 1828 to 1838, and I can look at the image and I can see all of the images that are in this microfilm. And if I look at the index, sometimes it'll tell me a page number, and then I can be like, okay, here is my ancestor's record, and maybe it wasn't on the index. So it's also a good idea to browse around the catalog if you have a good idea, if you are looking for a particular type of record. So let's say you really want to find a birth record for your family member. So these are baptisms. And this is a great place to find a birth record for your family member that was born in Mexico. If you look on the side here, it says format, and it has a little camera and it has a little search magnifying glass. The magnifying glass means that it's indexed. If it doesn't have a magnifying glass, that means it's not indexed. So let's say my ancestor was born in 1883, and you notice this hasn't been indexed, so it's not going to show up when I click on the FamilySearch little link on his profile and they search for it in the indexes. It's not going to show up in the search records function because it hasn't been indexed yet. But it very well could exist. So that's a good place to start. And you can browse the images and you can look for his birth date and you can find that record and you can still attach it to him without the index. But just because it's not showing up in the search function doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Before you check the catalog though, before you do all that work to see if you can't find that information, it's also a good idea to check what they call the FamilySearch wiki. The wiki has all the information you could ever want to know about a place. And it's another really good hidden gem of FamilySearch. And we're going to go over a little bit more about using the catalog in the future. This is just a very brief overview. But the wiki is a really, really good resource for everybody. And I'm going to show you how to use it. And you can find it in your search menu, pull down under Research Wiki. And it's one of my favorite tools because I don't have to know anything in my brain. I can just look on this wiki and find the information. So I'm going to show you an example of a foreign country. So let's say I know I have ancestors from Sweden, but I don't know anything about Sweden's genealogy. I don't know anything about Swedish. I don't know how to start. And this is how I'm going to start. I'm going to go to FamilySearch Wiki. I'm going to type in Sweden, and it'll bring up Sweden genealogy. This is what it's going to bring up for me, all this good information. It will tell me how to get started, how to find a place of origin, how to find birth information. It'll have this button right here, all the online genealogical records that they have for them. There's a community. I can go on and chat with other people who are also researching on their Swedish ancestors and get some tips. You can filter by county or area and learn more about that. It has all of these great tools. And then right here on the right, it has all these great other articles. So let's say I want to learn more about the church records of Sweden. I can click there. Let's say I don't know any Swedish at all. It'll tell me, here's a Swedish word list. And I can click on that. And it will tell me all of the words they could ever think of in Swedish that could be useful to you genealogically. And so you don't have to know Swedish to be able to understand it. You can look at the abbreviations they have. You can also look at a handwriting guide and see some of the examples of the old-fashioned Scandinavian handwriting. So just because you have ancestors from a foreign country and you don't speak that language, that doesn't mean that you can't do their research. So don't be afraid of your ancestors who came from across the pond. It'll also tell you really good information about when certain records were available. Like I was talking about Utah, how they didn't start taking birth records until 1898. I found that information here on the FamilySearch Wiki. I didn't just know that information. So for example, I'm gonna go to Marion County, Tennessee. And that's where one of my ancestors is from. And I'm gonna look and say, okay, I know he's from Marion County. I'm having a really hard time finding a marriage record. I really want a marriage record for this guy. But I wanna see, maybe I'm missing some information. So let's say he was, it says Marion County was established in 1817. So that's a good thing to know. So if he was born before 1817, there's no way that he was born in Marion County. He might be born in the same area that Marion County was, but it's going to be called a different name. So it's also important to check and see what other counties are nearby. You can also see right here the known beginning dates for the major county records. So I know births started in 1908, marriages are in 1881, 1908, 1842, all this good information. So I know that if my ancestor was married before 1881, that's pretty useless to go look for a marriage record. Now, I want to know why that is. Let's look at history. It'll tell a little bit of information about why it's called the way it is. It says Marion County was created in 1817 from Cherokee Indian lands. So it was, it didn't come from a different county. It was made from these Indian lands. It'll tell you the boundary changes. And now this is also really important. In 1922, the courthouse was destroyed by a fire. And it'll tell you, oh, there's record loss. So all the marriages between 1817 and 1880 were lost to a fire. Now, I could have spent hours and hours and hours looking for these marriage records in this county, but when I check this wiki, it tells me don't even bother, they were all burned up. So that saves me time, and it gives me an explanation for why I can't prove a marriage. So that's all good information to have. Like I said, don't be afraid to check the catalog and see what there is. There's a whole lot to explore. So for example, if I want to go to the catalog and I want to see what records are available for Marion County, Tennessee. If I just search for the place, it'll bring up this big old list of all the different records that can be found for my ancestor who lived there. Now, a lot of these are not going to be indexed, and they probably never will be. So it's always a good idea to see what's been uploaded. So some people have uploaded family Bibles that you wouldn't necessarily see in the record search, or if you want to see court records. Those are some murder, mayhem, and more. That might be fun to read and see if your ancestor was involved with that. But for the most part, the catalog is a great place to go exploring. If you think you found everything for your ancestor, I can promise you haven't. And the catalog is a great place to go look for that information. But no matter how hard you try, some ancestors are just going to be poorly documented, and they're going to be tricky. The farther back in your family tree, the more difficult it's going to be to find sources and to find those records. There is a point when records become non-existent and completely unreliable. For example, there's one line in my family tree that is somehow traced all the way back to Adam and Eve. And I can promise you that there are no records that have proven that. And nobody has like a birth certificate for Adam and Eve. And funnily enough, that line of mine goes through royalty. And this guy decided that he was not only related to Odin and Thor, but also Jesus Christ and Adam and Eve and all these things. So the farther you go back, the more the things are just kind of myth rather than fact. So don't get hung up on, there is going to be a point when your family tree, you can't really go any farther back, whether it's because of record loss or just the records didn't exist. But each ancestor that is in your tree needs a few things, especially if you want to do your family history temple work. To do temple work, you need name, gender, date, and place. Names, it's important to try and make these names as complete as possible, especially when it comes to your female ancestors. Use maiden names, don't use married names. Don't use nicknames either. There's a place here under other information to add nicknames. So even if somebody was known, let's say James was known by Jimmy his whole life, if his birth certificate says James Claridge Ellsworth, that should be the name that is in his family tree. And you can add those nicknames in the alternate information. Be careful that you don't use any words that aren't part of a person's actual name, like unnamed or mother or husband or aunt, because those will likely prevent you from being able to reserve those names for temple ordinances. And you'll get a little red exclamation point that says, needs more information. A lot of times you're not going to be able to find somebody's mother's name. You'll be able to find dad's name, but you won't be able to find mother's name. And that's just because historically women were not nearly as important because they didn't own land or pay taxes and all that junk. And it's frustrating because those women were important. But what you can do in order to do that temple work and seal families together still is you can go into the name and you can go Mrs., make sure it's in the title, and then you do husband's first name and husband's last name. So you can have Mrs. James Ellsworth if I didn't know what his wife's name was, and then I could seal them together, and then I could seal their children to them. Now it's important to try and find those names if you can. That is what FamilySearch has given us to do that, those women's work. For an individual with an unknown name or a child who died without a name, make sure that you don't put anything in the first name category. Don't put son or daughter or infant or Mr. or Mrs. or anything like that. Just put the name and then put the gender, and then you should be able to seal those children to their families. In some countries, and there's a policy with reserving temple ordinances that if there is a stillborn, that you do not seal them to their family. They're already sealed or whatnot. But in some countries, children who died shortly after birth were still listed as stillborn. So that could have been a day or two later. So some of those countries include Austria, some of the German states, France, a lot of European countries. And children who are listed as stillborn on records from those countries can still be sealed to their parents because there's no way of knowing if the child was actually stillborn or if they died shortly after birth. So pay attention to that. And if you do have a question about stillborns and what countries that applies to, you can go ahead and email me and I can send you that list if you're interested. The other information that you need to do temple work is a gender. That's pretty self-explanatory. Anybody who has a record should have a gender. Date. So that date needs to be either marriage, birth, or death. And it can be approximated. But if you do know the exact date, it should be in the format of a day, month, year. So when you do approximate a date, though, it's a really useful thing to do. So if you don't know exactly when your great-great-grandmother was born, but you know when your great-grandmother was born, you can kind of estimate off of that. So let's say grandma was born in 1900. It's safe to assume that her mother was at least 15 years old when she was born. So you can say born before 1885 and then work to find more solid information. But that will give you enough information to reserve that temple work. And the same with place. You're going to need either a place of birth, marriage, or death. And you're going to go smallest to largest jurisdiction, so city, county, state, country, or whatever the equivalent is. And that can also be approximated, and it can be as broad as you need. If you don't know the city, put the county. If you don't know the county, put the state or the country. And that's all you need to get started. But it's always a good idea to try to narrow that down because you're going to be able to find more names that way. Last but not least, I did want to show you one last tool, and it's under this help section right here. It's called the Help Center. So if you ever have a certain topic that you're interested in learning more about, or if you want just some general assistance, this is a great place to go. For example, let's say I really want to know how to do my Russian genealogy. They have articles here that are great to read. That's kind of like the wiki. They also have lessons. So they have an introduction to Russian research video. You can read Russian documents, things like that. So if you go to the help center right under here under help, it's just if you just want to learn something, that's a great place to go to get some good videos and some lessons to help walk you through a specific country's process or a certain type of record. And it's a great place to start. So I went a little long today, so I'm going to stop my screen share now, and I'm going to open it up for questions. We'll unmute here. So if anybody has a question, feel free to ask. I will be uploading this to YouTube soon, and we will get that channel out to you guys as soon as possible. But otherwise, just if you ever have a question, even if it's not tonight, feel free to email me or to contact your ward history consultants. They would be happy to help. Okay, let's see. I noticed somebody said, how do I clear a recommended task when I know there's no task to be done? I will show you right here. If you go, let me pull up let me screen share again. So if you go to the recommended task, some of those tasks are not necessarily useful. Like it will suggest a person has a child that's missing or their marriage or something, and you know that's not true, and you just want to check. You can go to their personal page. It says person may have another spouse, and you can just press this little dismiss if you know that that's not a research help that you want. You can also do that with sources. You can say dismiss, this isn't something that's useful. And it should delete those. And if you check on the research helps, it'll also show you what other people helps. So somebody dismissed all of these possible duplicates, and I can go through and make sure that they were right. Let's see. Okay, let's see. Here. Questions. Okay, what are we going to learn about next week? So next week, let me pull it up. Look at my curriculum real quick. I believe.
It's Amanda.
Hey, John.
Next week, we are going to be learning about a little more about record types. Like we'll go a little bit more in depth on census information and how we can use that information. Some of the more obscure record types like probate and land records. We'll also go over some of the databases that aren't provided by the church but are also useful, like newspapers.com, Find a Grave, and Fold3. If there's anything that somebody else, if there's any suggestions that you'd like me to go over, feel free to tell me. Okay, let's see. Can I remove a spouse that has been added incorrectly to a record? Okay.
Hello, Dad.
Actually,
She's getting somebody on accidentally. Maybe.
You can remove, that information can be removed from a person's view. So if you go to
I'm in a Zoom meeting.
person
That's
details
Randy
right here.
Brockenmeyer's taxes. He was supposed to come over today,
You can
but he
edit,
hasn't shown up.
if it's on somebody's profile, you can edit the marriage information right here with this little, oh, sorry, I'm not sharing. That's not very, there we go. Okay. So family members, you can remove children and add spouses and remove spouses with these little edit buttons. And it's important to be really careful before you do that, in case it's information, in case it's always hard to reconnect than it is to remove. So when you say remove or replace, it'll ask you for a very specific reason. But that's how you can remove incorrect spouses on pages. As far as sources, you can detach sources. Does that answer your question? Maybe. Okay. All right. Does anybody have any other questions? If not, we will go ahead and end this lesson. Next week's lesson will be same time, same method. We're going to do Zoom. So next Thursday.
From Amanda.
Yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more.
Awesome, JD. It's nice to see you. Your home office looks very official.
Don't read it out loud, John.
Great organization happens there. I hope
I wonder how soon church.
orders are all giving you some.
Melanie.
Your own
Yes.
personal history. All those grandkids. You have all your words of wisdom in one place. Man.
The ceilings.
Sorry, I had a brain freeze.
Oh, you're good.
Hey, now. You say
All right. If anybody has any other questions, feel free to message me or email me. But as for right now, that's all I have. So
Thank you.
no problem.